The baby's cry was the only sound for miles, a thin, desperate thread of life in a world that had gone silent. Evelyn sat on the packed dirt floor of the cabin, the smell of iron and birth still clinging to her, two squalling girls in her arms. She'd buried her husband less than 2 weeks ago, dug the grave herself under the lone cottonwood tree. Now the afterbirth was barely scraped from her skirts, and she was listening to a horse approach. Then came the drumming of hooves. At first she thought it was her own heart, a frantic thudding in her ears born from pure exhaustion. But the sound grew. It got louder, heavier, until it rolled through the ground beneath her knees like a promise of thunder. She gathered the twins closer, their damp heads tucking against the hollow of her chest. The cabin door stood wide open. She hadn't had the strength to bar it last night. Pale dawn spilled inside, lighting up dust motes that floated in the air like tiny, silent ghosts. The shadow fell over the doorway first. It was enormous, blotting out the morning sun. For one wild, terrified breath, she thought death itself had finally come to claim the three of them. He sat high in the saddle, the rising sun flaring behind him, turning his face into a dark, unreadable cutout. His shoulders were as wide as a barn door. The horse blew steam into the chill air and shifted its weight, waiting. The man's hat brim tilted down as he looked at her. The silence stretched. It pulled and pulled until she thought she might scream, just to break the terrible tension. "Your man owed me," he said at last. His voice was low, measured, each word shaped like a judgment. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. "Who are you?" "Gideon Hale." The name rolled like gravel in a dry creek bed. "Your husband bought this land with my money last spring. He promised me a share of the crop by winter." He paused, his invisible gaze sweeping the desolate cabin. "Folks in town said you'd never make it. I came to see if they were right." She wanted to stand, to find her feet, but her body was a leaden weight that would not obey. "We're still here," she said. Her voice cracked, betraying just how close she had come to failing completely. His gaze took in everything: the cold hearth, the meager stores in the corner, the tattered, stained blanket she knelt on. His mouth tightened into a hard, unreadable line. "You'll need milk for those girls before nightfall," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. "And wood. You've not got near enough for another frost." "I can manage." She said it too quickly, too fiercely. To admit otherwise, to show even a crack in her armor, would shatter her into a million pieces. He dismounted without asking for leave. He was so tall, he had to duck to get through the cabin door. He smelled of sweat, of leather, of the cold morning air. As he stepped inside, the babies stilled. It was as if the sheer weight of his presence was enough to quiet them. Evelyn stiffened, a wave of regret washing over her. She should have barred the door. She should have found the strength. But he didn't move toward her. He crouched by the hearth, testing the small, sad stack of wood with a gloved hand. "You've got half a day's worth," he stated, his voice flat. "Less if the wind picks up." "I said I can manage." His eyes, pale grey like ice on the edge of melting, flicked to hers. "This country doesn't forgive pride, Mrs. Hart." The use of her name, her husband's name, made something cold twist inside her gut. She gritted her teeth, adjusting one of the babies against her shoulder. "I buried my husband myself. I dug the hole. I said the words. Don't you dare tell me what I can't do." For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds in the tiny cabin were the soft, shallow breaths of the girls, the restless shifting of the horse outside, the far-off call of a meadowlark greeting the sun. Then Gideon stood, and the room seemed to shrink around him. She felt as if the low ceiling and rough-hewn walls might crush her under his gaze. "You've got grit," he said finally. It wasn't praise. It was just an observation. But grit alone won't keep them alive. "I'll bring you goat's milk by sundown." "I don't want your charity." "It isn't charity," he shot back, his voice hardening. "It's survival. Your husband made a deal. This land, this cabin, it's all collateral. Now it's mine. But I'm not a monster. I'll give you a chance." He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Take the milk, or I'll watch you bury them next to their father. Then I'll take back what belongs to me." The bluntness of it, the cold, hard business of it, made her flinch. But she could not look away. Something in his eyes, something old and weary, told her he had seen graves dug too shallow. He had seen children laid in them. He turned toward the door, ducking under the frame again. For a moment the morning light hallowed him, as if the earth itself was weighing whether to grant her mercy or simply let her fall. "Why do you care?" she called after him, her voice sharper than she intended. He paused, one hand on his saddle horn. He didn't turn around. "Because no one else will ride out this far," he said, and swung himself up onto the horse. "And I don't like seeing good land go to waste." Then he was gone. The pounding of hooves faded down the trail until the sound was swallowed by the vast, empty hush of the prairie. Evelyn sat motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The babies, as if sensing the void he left behind, began to fuss again. She rocked them, whispering nonsense until they quieted, though her own breath still came in ragged, shallow gasps. Through the open door, she could see the track his horse had cut into the damp earth. It led back toward the world she had left behind, the world that had already judged her. Widow, mother of two, a failure before she'd even begun. Her fingers curled tight around the soft, warm bodies of her daughters. Shame burned in her throat, hot and acrid. Not because she doubted she could keep them alive, but because she knew in her bones just how close she had already come to failing. The cabin felt smaller now. The silence was louder, heavier. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to warm the dusty floorboards in the doorway, she had risen. Her knees shook, but she stood. She laid another precious log on the fire, watching the thin, stubborn curl of smoke rise toward the sky. She told herself she would find a way, with or without Gideon Hale and his terrifying kindness. But as she stood there, staring at the single pathetic stack of wood left against the wall, she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the core. If the wind rose tonight, the fire would die before dawn, and she would have to choose: swallow her pride, or let the prairie take what was left of her family. The hours after he left were a blur of rage and fear. By noon the babies had quieted, fed on the last of her own strength, but Evelyn's mind had not. She worked until sweat ran cold under her collar, bringing the axe down on a stubborn log with arms that ached for more than just labor. The wood would not crack on the first swing, nor the second. She thought of Gideon Hale's words, cold and sharp as the axe blade itself. Bury them next to their father before summer. She brought the axe down with a raw cry that startled the twins awake inside the cabin. She left the axe buried deep in the chopping block and went inside. She gathered them close, their small, perfect faces pressed against her, their breaths warm and milky on her neck. They did not know their father was gone. They did not know their mother had nothing left but 2 goats that wouldn't freshen until spring and a dwindling sack of flour that felt more like dust. They knew only her warmth, her heartbeat. And right now, that heartbeat was a frantic drum of desperation. She had to be enough. She had to. By the time the sun began its slow drop toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, she heard him again, that same heavy, rhythmic drumming of hooves. It was a sound that now signaled both dread and a sliver of shameful hope. Gideon rode into the yard with a lidded pail tied to his saddle. He swung down without a word, his movements economical and sure. He set the pail near the door. "You came," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You need it," he answered simply, not looking at her. She hated the way relief rose in her throat like a sob. She fought it back, swallowed it down. "I said I'd manage." "And you will," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers. "With this." She knelt and opened the pail. The goat's milk was still warm. The smell was sharp and clean and achingly alive. Her throat was tight. "I'll pay you," she said, her voice stiff. He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You'll owe me nothing but staying alive. You and them." She bristled at his tone, at the assumption. "You speak as though it's not my choice." His eyes were steady on her, the pale gray of a coming storm. "It's not. Those girls didn't choose to be born out here, in the middle of nowhere, with winter coming on. Their only choice is whether you fight for them or not." The words landed like heavy stones, and she felt the cold, hollow space of the cottonwood grave all over again. He was right, and that made her hate him even more. Behind him the wind shifted, and it carried a new sound. The creak of wagon wheels and the plodding of tired horses. A buckboard rattled into view, driven by a man in a dusty black coat. The town preacher. He tipped his hat as he pulled his team to a halt. "Mrs. Hart," he called out, his voice carrying an air of practiced solemnity. "I heard word from town there were babes born out here. I've come to offer a blessing." Evelyn stiffened, a hot flush of anger and shame rising in her chest. She did not want town eyes on her, not now, not ever. She didn't want their pity or their prayers or their judgment. But the preacher was already climbing down from his seat, his Bible tucked under his arm. Gideon, to her surprise, simply stood back, melting into the shadows of the cabin wall, letting the man pass. Evelyn sat on the threshold, the twins bundled in her lap, feeling trapped. The preacher knelt before her, his weathered face a mask of solemn concern. "The Lord gives strength to the weary," he murmured, tracing the sign of the cross in the air above the babies' heads. His eyes, however, were fixed on her. "Yet he tests the proud. This land requires humility, Mrs. Hart. Will you bend, or will you break?" Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. "I've already bent," she said through her teeth. He gave her a look of patient, weary sorrow, a look she was sure he'd given to countless others before her. "There's more to come. There always is." He offered a short, formal prayer, the words about grace and mercy rising into the pale, indifferent sky. Then he mounted his wagon again and rattled back toward town, leaving the sound of his wheels echoing long after he'd vanished from sight. The silence he left behind felt heavy, accusatory. When he was gone, Gideon spoke from the shadows. "He's right, you know." She shot him a look as sharp as a shard of flint. "You came to see if I'd fail. Now you're quoting scripture at me? Why do you care if I bend?" For a long, unnerving moment, he didn't answer. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he said, his voice flat, almost too even, as if he were reciting a fact from a book, "Because I know what happens when a woman breaks out here." The words hung in the air between them, devoid of emotion but full of a terrible, unseen weight. She stared at him, trying to read the story behind them, searching his face for some clue. He gave her nothing. His face was a mask of stone. "I'll make it," she said, her own voice a fierce whisper. He nodded once, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "Then I'll bring more milk tomorrow." Before she could object, before she could find the words to tell him to stay away, he swung into the saddle and was gone again. He left her with a pail of milk, 2 sleeping babies, and a silence that rang louder and more frightening than ever before. She fed the twins slowly, one then the other, until their small bellies were round and full, and they drifted off to sleep in a milky haze. The cabin was dark by then, lit only by the hungry, flickering flames of the fire. She sat on the floor, staring into the flames, her mind a whirlwind. The preacher's words circled and circled. "Will you bend, or will you break?" The image of Gideon's back as he rode away was carved sharp and clear behind her eyes. I know what happens when a woman breaks out here. What had he seen? What ghost was he living with that made him ride out to the edge of the world to keep a stranger alive? When the wind rose after midnight, rattling the loose shutters and moaning under the door, she got up and fed the fire with the last of her wood. It burned too hot, too fast, a desperate blaze against the encroaching cold. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gideon standing in her doorway, his grey eyes like judgment, telling her she would bury her children before summer. By dawn, her mind was made up. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. If the firewood gave out before nightfall, she would ride into town with the babies. She would face the looks, the whispers. She would swallow the bitter pill of her own failure. She would trade what she must, beg if she had to. She would not let her daughters freeze. But as she stepped outside into the thin gold light of the new day, she froze. Leaning against the cabin wall was a stack of wood, fresh split, neatly piled. Enough to last a week, maybe more. Gideon Hale had come in the night. Silently, like a ghost. For a moment, something that felt terrifyingly like gratitude swelled in her chest, a hot wave that threatened to undo her completely. She shoved it back down, burying it under a fresh layer of pride and resentment. She went inside, fed the greedy fire, and dressed the twins. Her mind was already racing, turning over this new, confusing piece of the puzzle. If he thought he could ride in and save her, piece by piece, he was wrong. She would not be some charity case, some project to ease his own conscience. If he came again tonight, she would be waiting. She would meet him at the door, and she would tell him so. The days stretched long, each one stitched to the next by the thin wail of hungry infants and the ceaseless bone-deep labor of staying alive. Evelyn rose before the sun, her back aching as if someone had laid a beam of iron across it while she slept. She hauled water from the creek, her shoulders screaming in protest. She stoked the fire, fed the twins by the faint flickering glow of the hearth, and then stepped outside into the biting air to split kindling with hands that blistered and bled despite the calluses already forming there. Each morning she told herself Gideon would not come. Each morning she was wrong. He appeared out of the morning mist like something summoned, a silent spectre on a powerful horse. He would leave the pail of milk by the door, give a single curt nod, and be gone. He never stayed. He never spoke. At first, she resented the sound of his horse, the way it made her chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to relief. Then she began to resent herself for listening for it, for the part of her that strained to hear that distant drumming of hooves each dawn. The cabin became a world measured in the smallest of victories. The day the girls first slept for 2 hours straight, she wept silently into their blanket, the tears hot on her cheeks. The day she managed to mend the leaking roof with a scrap of canvas her husband had left behind, and the afternoon rain stayed out, she felt as though she had won a great and terrible war. But there were failures too. Failures that felt like gaping wounds. The day she dropped the heavy iron kettle, spilling the last of their flour into the dirt and dust of the floor. She just sank down beside the mess, the white powder clinging to her skirt like a shroud. She stayed there, motionless, until the fire went cold and the cabin was filled with a chilling gloom. That was the day Gideon came inside without asking. She heard his heavy boots on the threshold, then felt his presence fill the small room, blocking out what little light remained. "Get out," she said, her voice a hoarse, broken thing. She didn't lift her head from her knees. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was calm, a simple statement of fact. She looked down. In her haste to catch the falling kettle, she'd sliced her palm open on its sharp edge. Blood had streaked the floor, drying to a rusty brown on her fingers. She hadn't even felt it. He crouched beside her, and his big, rough hand was surprisingly careful as he took hers and began to wrap a clean cloth around it. She flinched at the intimacy of it, the unexpected gentleness. "You'll ruin that rag," she muttered, the words thick in her throat. "I've got more rags," he said, his voice still quiet. She almost laughed. She almost wept. Instead, she bit her lip until she tasted blood and did neither. When he was finished, he moved with a silent, steady purpose. He lit the fire. He put a fresh kettle of water on to boil. He found a bit of wire in his pocket and with a pair of pliers from his saddlebag, mended the broken kettle handle. He did it all without a word, as if he were simply fixing a fence post or a broken hinge, not stepping into the hollow, broken center of her entire life. When he finally left, the cabin felt emptier, colder and more silent than ever before. That night she sat by the fire, rocking the twins, and caught herself thinking of the look on his face as he'd worked. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment. It was just a quiet, steady purpose, and that unnerved her more than cruelty ever could have. Word began to trickle from town, carried on the wind like poison seeds. When she finally had to ride in for supplies, her flour sack empty, she heard the children's voices first. They chanted a cruel little rhyme as they played in the street. "Widow Hart, tears in her eyes, Gideon Hale brings her supplies." Then she saw the women gathered on the mercantile porch, their voices dropping to whispers as she passed. "They say he's there near every dawn. A man like that doesn't do anything for free." She kept her head held high, her back ramrod straight, but her stomach churned with a sick, burning acid. She could feel their eyes on her back, could practically hear the whispers curling in the air behind her when she turned away. When she returned to the cabin that evening, the heavy weight of their judgment settling on her shoulders, Gideon was there. He was leaning against his horse as if he'd been waiting for her. "You've been in town," he said. It wasn't a question. He could read the stiffness in her shoulders, the hard set of her jaw. Yes, they're talking. I know. He studied her face for a long moment, and something that looked almost like sympathy passed over his own stern features. Let them. You've got more important things to worry about. That's easy for you to say, she snapped, the anger and humiliation of the day boiling over. You ride away when you please. You don't have to live with their eyes on you. He straightened up from the horse, his full height seeming to block out the setting sun. Would you rather I stopped coming? The question struck her harder than a physical blow. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The honest answer was trapped in her throat, a terrifying, confusing thing. She wanted to scream yes. She wanted to scream no. I don't know, she admitted, the words barely a whisper. For a long moment, the only sound was the tired horse shifting its weight, the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Then Gideon said, his voice low and rough, "You've been alone too long, Mrs. Hart. It makes a body think being hard is the same as being strong." "I am strong," she insisted, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, his pale eyes seeming to see right through the walls she'd built around herself, until she felt the terrible truth of what he meant. That night she lay awake long after the babies slept, staring up at the dark rafters. Strength, she thought, was not supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel so hollow, so sharp-edged, so utterly and completely alone. The days passed in a rhythm she could no longer name. Gideon's quiet, steady visits became less jarring, though she still bristled at them, at her own unwilling dependence. Sometimes he stayed longer. He'd mend a fence post that had rotted through or leave a sack of beans on her step without a word. Sometimes they spoke little more than a clipped greeting, yet with each silent exchange she felt something shift, a thread pulling taut and strange between them. One afternoon, a cold rain blew in from the north. Through the grey sheet of it, she saw him on the ridge, not on his horse, but on foot, driving two shaggy goats toward her small, rickety pen. "I don't need goats," she called out, standing on the porch with the twins bundled in her arms, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. "You do," he called back, his voice carrying over the rising howl of the wind. By the time she'd gotten the stubborn animals into the pen, her heart was beating far too fast, and it wasn't just from the work. That night, she poured the first milk from her own goats into a tin cup, and she felt something in her chest finally ease, just a little. A tiny bit of the crushing weight lifted. Still, the storm that had threatened all day broke with a furious vengeance after midnight. Rain hammered the newly patched roof like 1,000 tiny fists. The wind clawed at the shutters, seeking a way in, and in the darkest hour of the night, one of the twins woke with a sharp, piercing cry. Evelyn picked her up, and her heart stopped. The baby's skin was on fire, a hot, frightening fever. Evelyn held her close, rocking by the fire until her arms went numb and her eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep. But the baby's skin only burned hotter. Her breathing grew shallow. The cabin, once her fortress, felt suddenly too small, the fire too weak against the raging storm and the chilling fear. Panic rose like black water inside her chest, cold and suffocating. By dawn, the fever had not broken. The wind howled across the plains like a hungry wolf, and the trail to town, she knew, would be a river of impassable mud. She didn't care. With shaking hands, she wrapped both girls in every blanket she owned and strapped them to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She saddled the old mule, its eyes wide with fear at the storm. She would ride for town, for a doctor, for medicine, for help, and damn the whispers. Damn them all to hell. But as she swung her leg over the saddle, a horse and rider appeared through the blinding curtain of rain. Gideon. He rode hard, his coat plastered to his back, his face set like stone. "Get down," he roared, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You'll drown out there." "I have to get to town," she screamed back, her voice torn away by the gale. He reined his powerful horse so close that she could feel the heat and smell the wet animal. "Then let me take you," he said, his voice a low, urgent growl that cut through the storm's chaos. "Or you won't make it at all." The rain turned the trail into a treacherous river of sucking, pulling mud. Her old mule's hooves slipped and slid with every step. Evelyn's heart seized in her chest, and she clutched the reins tighter as the babies wailed against her, their cries thin and lost in the roar of the storm. Then Gideon's horse loomed close beside her, a dark, powerful shape in the grey chaos. His animal was sure-footed, steady where hers floundered and panicked. "Give me the girls," he shouted over the storm. "No!" The word was torn from her throat, a raw, primal sound of defiance and terror. "You'll lose them if you keep on like this." His face was streaked with rain, his dark hair plastered to his brow, and his grey eyes burned with a fierce intensity she'd never seen before. "Evelyn, give them to me." She stared at him, breathing in ragged, painful gasps, the cold rain running down her back like icy fingers. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she would not be saved by him or any other man. But the sick baby's breath was a shallow, painful rasp against her neck. Her fevered face pressed hot against Evelyn's collarbone. Her own hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. With a choked sob, she unstrapped the precious bundle and passed them over the churning mud between their mounts. Gideon gathered the twins against his broad chest as though they were made of the most breakable glass. "Follow me," he commanded, and wheeled his horse, not toward the town, but up toward the high ridge. She spurred the terrified mule after him, her heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The ride to his ranch was a waking nightmare, a blur of wind and water and fear. The storm lashed at them with such fury that she could barely see the dark outline of his house until they were nearly on top of it. He swung down from his horse and carried the babies inside while she slid from the saddle, stumbling through the deep mud after him. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. His cabin was larger than hers, cleaner, with a massive stone hearth where a fire blazed, hot and welcoming. The air hung thick with the smell of wood smoke, leather, and brewing coffee. "By the fire," Gideon said, already stripping off his soaked coat. He laid the babies on a thick quilt near the flames, moving with a surprising gentleness that startled her. Evelyn knelt beside them, her numb fingers brushing wet hair from their tiny faces. The sick one whimpered, her breath still dangerously shallow. Gideon crouched next to her, his big hands hovering over the child, not touching, but radiating a tense energy. "She's burning up," he said quietly. "I know." He stood and moved quickly around the room, setting a kettle to boil, fetching clean cloths from a chest. She watched him work, every motion sure and practiced. When he knelt again, he wrung out a cloth in cool water and laid it gently against the baby's forehead. Evelyn felt something inside her, something that had been frozen solid for months, finally begin to crack. "I can't lose her," she whispered, the words breaking apart as she said them. "You won't." She looked up at him, her own face streaked with rain and tears. "You speak as though you can promise that." "I can promise I'll sit here with you until the fever breaks," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Or until it takes her. Either way, you won't be alone." The words hit her harder than the wind and the rain outside. They struck some deep, hidden place inside her that she thought had died with her husband. Hours passed, measured only by the hiss of the storm against the window panes and the soft, labored sound of the baby's breathing. Evelyn's body ached from stillness, but she dared not move, dared not even breathe too deeply. Gideon stayed near, adding wood to the fire, changing the cool cloths, his presence a solid grounding force in the terrifying chaos of the night. At some point, she must have dozed, her head slumped against the warm stones of the hearth. Because when she opened her eyes, the room had gone quiet. The wind had died down to a whisper. The only sound was the steady, gentle tick of rain on the roof. Gideon was sitting in a chair he'd pulled close to the fire, and the sick child was asleep against his chest, her tiny fists curled in the fabric of his shirt. Evelyn's throat closed. She watched the rise and fall of the baby's chest. It was steady now. Even. The fever's fire was cooling. "You should sleep," Gideon said without looking up. "I can't." He glanced at her then, and in the flickering firelight, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't softness, not exactly. It was recognition. The silent understanding of two people who had both carried more weight than they should have, and were somehow, miraculously, still standing. "You're not weak for letting someone stand beside you," he said quietly. She stared into the fire, and tears she didn't know she had left began to slip down her cheeks, hot and silent. "I don't know how." "Then learn," he said. The storm wore itself out toward dawn. The first pale, watery light broke through the clouds, glinting on the wet fields outside. Gideon rose carefully so as not to wake the child. He laid the baby back down on the quilt beside her sister, then crossed to the window, peering out at the newly washed world. "It'll be clear by noon," he said. Evelyn stood, her legs trembling, and came to look. The world outside gleamed, every blade of grass silvered with rain. It felt like standing at the edge of something new. Not just the end of the storm, but something larger, something she couldn't yet name. Behind them, one of the babies stirred, whimpering softly. Evelyn turned. Gideon didn't move from the window. "She lived," Evelyn said, as if the words themselves might make it more real. "She did." Evelyn crossed the room, knelt by the babies, and pressed a kiss to each of their damp heads. Then she looked up at Gideon, her heart hammering a slow, steady, hopeful beat. "You brought us through." He finally turned from the window and shook his head. "You brought yourself through," he said. "I just kept the fire lit." She stood, and for the first time since she had stood over her husband's fresh grave, she felt her spine straighten. Not from stubbornness, but from something that felt like real strength. "Take us home," she said. Gideon nodded once. Outside, the sky was turning gold. The ride back to her cabin was quiet, but it was not a heavy silence. The storm-washed world glittered under the newborn sun, and puddles in the trail shone like scattered mirrors across the prairie. Evelyn held both girls close against her chest, feeling the steady, miraculous beat of their hearts against her own. Every sure step of Gideon's horse seemed to carry them deeper into a world that felt remade, softer and gentler somehow. When they reached the cabin, Gideon swung down and, for the first time, offered her his hand to help her dismount. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, that old, familiar pride twitching like a half-broken thing inside her. Then she placed her fingers in his palm. His grip was warm, steady. He helped her down as though she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. Inside, the cabin smelled of old smoke and damp earth and spilled milk, but it no longer felt small and confining. It felt like home. She laid the girls in their cradle and turned to face him. He stood near the door, holding his hat in his hands, looking as though he might turn and leave without another word, as if their shared ordeal in the storm had been a dream. "Will you come back?" she asked, the words surprising herself as much as they seemed to surprise him. He studied her, that unreadable gaze of his, weighing something deep within him. "If you ask me to," he said, his voice low. She nodded once, a small, decisive movement. "Then come." Something in his broad shoulders seemed to ease. He crossed the room and crouched by the cradle, looking down at the sleeping girls. His rough, calloused hands rested on his knees, as if he dared not reach out and touch them. "They look like him," he said softly, his voice thick with an unexpected emotion. "They do." Evelyn's voice was steady now. "But they'll grow up knowing they had more than just him keeping them here." He looked up at her then, and whatever was in his eyes, raw and unguarded, made her breath catch in her throat. Life found a new rhythm, a better one. The goats gave milk, the firewood stayed stacked, and Gideon's visits became a part of the day, not an intrusion. Sometimes he would bring small things: a loaf of fresh bread from town, a new hinge for the rattling door, a small carved wooden bird for the girls to look at. Sometimes he would just sit in the chair by the fire, holding one of the babies in his powerful arms, watching the flames burn. He was a quiet, steady presence, a rock in the vast sea of the prairie. One evening, the younger twin let out a sneeze so powerful it startled herself into crying. And Evelyn laughed, a real, deep, honest laugh. The sound was so alien in the small cabin that it startled her too. She hadn't heard it in months. Gideon looked up from the cradle, and a slow, rare smile spread across his weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The moment felt like a tiny seed, finally pushing its way through hard, frozen earth. But the town tongues did not stop wagging. When Evelyn rode in for flour, she heard two women talking near the mercantile porch, their voices like the rustle of dry leaves. "They say Gideon hails out there every night," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. They say he's half moved in. A disgrace, with her husband not even cold in the ground. Evelyn kept walking, her head held high, but the words were like tiny stinging barbs. That night, she told Gideon what she had heard. She expected him to shrug, to say, "Let them talk," as he always did. But this time, his grey eyes were steady on hers. "They already have judged you, Evelyn," he said simply. "They judged you the day you arrived. The question is whether you're going to let them decide who you are." His words settled over her, not like a weight, but like a warm blanket. She thought of the long, terrifying winter, of the lonely grave under the cottonwood tree, of the countless nights she had nearly given up completely. She thought of how she was standing now, not bowed, not begging, not broken. The next Sunday, she knew what she had to do. She saddled the mule and dressed the twins in their cleanest homespun shirts. She rode into town with her back straight and her chin up. And Gideon walked beside her horse, his presence a silent declaration. The street grew quiet as they passed. Heads turned, whispers rose and fell like a brush fire in a high wind. At the church steps, she dismounted. Gideon took the girls from her while she climbed the wooden stairs. The preacher stood in the doorway, surprise flickering over his solemn face. "I've come to give thanks," she said, before he could speak a single word. Her voice carried over the small, stunned gathering of townsfolk. "For the rain, for the goats, for the strength to see another day, and for those who ride through storms to keep strangers from dying." A ripple passed through the crowd. No one spoke. Gideon handed her the girls and stepped up to stand beside her, his hat held respectfully in his hands. The preacher's weathered face softened, the judgment in his eyes replaced with something that looked like understanding. "Then let us pray," he said. They bowed their heads, and the town for a moment bowed with them. When it was done, no one said a word as Evelyn and Gideon walked back to the mule. On the ride home, the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, gold and crimson and violet, the prairie alight with fire. The wind lifted Evelyn's hair from her shoulders, and she breathed deep, tasting wood smoke and rain and something that felt, for the first time, like freedom. When they reached the cabin, Gideon lingered by the door. "I should go," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She looked at him, at this quiet, hard man who had become her anchor. "You could stay," she answered. His eyes searched hers, as though looking for a permission he hadn't known he wanted. "I'm not asking you to save me," she said quietly, her voice full of a strength she didn't know she possessed a few months ago. "I'm asking you to be here." For a long moment, he just stood there, the last light of the day catching the hard line of his jaw. Then he stepped inside, and he closed the door behind him. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the girls slept peacefully in their cradle between them, Evelyn lay awake, listening to the night sounds. The distant creak of the windmill, the soft, steady breathing of the man beside her. She realized the fear, the cold, gnawing fear that had clung to her like a second skin since her husband's death, was finally gone. It was replaced by something warmer, steadier, something solid. Sometimes the prairie did not take. Sometimes it gave back. If you have ever stood alone, holding something fragile and precious and wondering if you were enough, know this: strength does not always mean standing apart. Sometimes true strength means letting another soul keep the fire going when your own hands are too tired to strike the flint. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.